by request, the original Indy game, on this fifth side story to Good Intentions. The documentation of video game history can be a fascinating pursuit, at least for some people. Why else would I be pouring all this energy into tracing the evolution of Game Boy and NES games for a tiny but enthusiastic audience? For the most part, I've been wading in fairly shallow waters of history with my Retronauts video chronicles, never really venturing into murky depths of the unknown. Given infinite time, money, and energy, I might well go spelunking in unfamiliar caverns of early 80s Japanese PCs, Russian clone consoles, or platforms like the Game 8. But honestly, it can be a challenge enough to find meaningful details and information on games for some of the best-selling systems in the world, let alone those obscurities. Take Arumana no Kiseki, for example. This fascinating platformer, whose title means The Miracle of Almana, launched in Japan in 1987 exclusively for the Famicom Disk System. Hailing from international 8-bit superpower Konami, Almana sits in good company and is hardly obscure. It's a contemporary of other Konami adventures like Contra, Castlevania 2, Metal Gear, and The Goonies 2. If anything, its company was probably a little too good. Nintendo, limited the number of games any single publisher could bring to the US during the NES era, and Konami wouldn't establish its Ultra Games shell until 1988, which means we probably never saw the Miracle of Almana here, simply because there were so many other great games for Konami to cherry-pick in the US to fill its limited allocation of releases. Even more so than fellow Konami FDS import creation Biomiracle Bukete Upa, Almana feels like a perfect archaeological relic from a very specific time and place in Konami's history. I don't mean that entirely in a good way. By the time Ultra Games existed to loosen Konami's US localization limits, Almana would have felt a bit dated. A relic, if you will, which is perhaps fitting due to its Indiana Jones vibe, but maybe not a good hook to hang a growing business on. There is a certain nostalgic value in this game for old NES veterans who cut their teeth on Konami classics back when the company's distinctive silver trim boxes stood out in a modest sea of NES software as a guarantee of entertaining game design married to audiovisual excellence. You can hear common sound effects with Castlevania and The Goonies 2 here, and the animation and character physics peg this as a cousin to Russian Attack. In fact, I would be shocked to learn that Almana wasn't produced by largely the same team as Russian Attack. It's easy to imagine them wrapping up development for that game and thinking, well, we did Rambo, now it's time for Indiana Jones. Indeed, everything about Almana, from the fedora-clad adventurer hero with the ability to climb a line to the fact that the premise is basically go recover the Sankara stones to lift the curse on this hapless village, feels like the copyright infringement edition of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It's also a much better take on that film than Tengen and Mindscape's NES adaptation of Atari's properly licensed Temple of Doom game, which makes this game's absence stateside something of a bummer. So you control a stiff action hero journeying through a series of platform stages, fighting a constant onslaught of thuggy-like guards and snakes. Seriously, it's not even subtle about this. Our hero, Kaito, carries a limited arsenal of throwing daggers with which to fend off the bad guys. As in Russian Attack, you can collect better weapons along the way. Where this game feels more advanced than its presumed predecessor is in the fact that your weapon selections are nowhere near as limited or as binary as they are in Russian Attack. Weapon pickups appear in packs of 10, and there are roughly half a dozen different weapon types, and you can freely toggle between them at any time by tapping the select button. The live weapon switch system, and by live I mean it doesn't involve the use of a submenu, it definitely pegs this as a 1987 creation. Almana sits in that awkward time where developers aspire to give more RPG and adventure-like depths to even the most blistering of action games, but hadn't completely settled on how that should work precisely. Almana reminds me a lot of Data East's NES port of Karnov, really. Well-intended and ambitious, but also somewhat clumsy in execution. Enemies spawn infinitely from doors all around the screen, often leaving you without the means to react in time to avoid taking a hit. And Kaito moves somewhat inelegantly. The dude can't duck an attack for one thing, and then there's the bit that really makes Almana stand out, Kaito's grappling wire. You could almost forgive Almana its Indiana Jones similarities as a coincidence, but then Kaito busts out his grappling wire, which is straight up Indy's whip minus the offensive capabilities. One assumes Konami didn't want to crowd its other whip-wielding NES hero in that regard. By pressing up and attack, Kaito flings a rope upward at a 45-degree angle, well, more like 30, but it adheres to walls or the undersides of platforms and allows you to climb up to reach higher areas. It's here you can really begin to see why Almana didn't make its way to the US. By the time it would have been localized, the poor thing had already been grossly outclassed by Capcom's BIONIC Commando. The Miracle of Almana plays like a game inspired by the arcade version of BIONIC Commando, in which your grappling controls were fussy and uncooperative. 1988's NES version of BIONIC Commando, on the other hand, greatly refined those mechanics to result in one of the most fluid and dynamic action games of its era. But grappling here can be extremely difficult to pull off correctly. The limitation of only grappling at 45-degree angles means you have to line up your placement just right, which can be difficult in the heat of combat. And midway through the first stage, you have to figure out how to manage grappling from moving platforms, which is no easy task. The Miracle of Almana is a difficult and frequently brutal game, but the challenge comes as much from its clunky mechanics as it does from deliberate design. Which brings us back to the beginning of this episode and the challenges of documenting video game history. Given all the other influences Almana wears on its rugged khaki sleeve, it would be easy to accuse Konami of ripping off BIONIC Commando as well. Certainly developers weren't shy about lifting interesting ideas from successful and popular games back then. Konami saw no end of its own hits, like Gradius and Castlevania, being cloned throughout the NES era. And turnabout is fair play, right? But the history of video games isn't some linear journey where you can draw a simple connection from one dot to the next. Almana may have been influenced somewhat by BIONIC Commando, but more likely Konami created the game based on inspiration drawn from the company's own history. Journey back a few years to a time before third-party games for Nintendo systems, to the ancient year of 1983, and you'll find an intriguing arcade release from Konami called ROC'N Rope. Like the Miracle of Almana, ROC'N Rope stars an archaeologist adventurer battling his way up a series of platforms populated by men and reptiles that emerge from caves set in the wall as he endeavors to collect legendary relics, in this case the pinions of a golden phoenix. And much like Kaito, ROC'N Rope's hero makes his ascent by launching a grappling hook at a 30-degree angle. Almana's rope mechanics work exactly the same as those of ROC'N Rope's. Not only does the grappling wire fire upward exactly the same way in both games, both involve a strange element in which the rope connects to a makeshift post the hero anchors in the ground. There's even a magical crystal in each game, one that renders the hero invincible in ROC'N Rope, and one that wipes everything off the screen in Almana. There's little question of the connection despite the name, which means the impetus behind the creation of this game was probably less a matter of let's rip off Indiana Jones, and more along the lines of we need to make a ROC'N Rope sequel, and Indiana Jones would be a very logical theme for a game about an adventurer who seeks mystical relics while scrambling along a rope. Why the game came out as Arumana no Kiseki rather than ROC'N Rope 2 or whatever may never be known. Maybe it was never meant to be a true sequel but more of a spiritual descendant. Or maybe it took on enough of its own distinct personality and development that it ultimately made more sense to simply call it something else. In any case, it's definitely not a BIONIC Commando ripoff. Which isn't to say that two games aren't connected at all. The original ROC'N Rope was designed by a young whippersnapper by the name of Tokuro Fujiwara. Soon after, Fujiwara would depart Konami for the fresh green pastures of a fledgling company called Capcom, where he would help design classics like Ghosts 'n Goblins and Mega Man. Oh, and he also directed one other notable arcade game at Capcom, one Top Secret, better known in the US as BIONIC Commando. Which means the Miracle of Almana isn't a BIONIC Commando ripoff, but rather its brother from another mother. It is not, unfortunately, nearly so refined a game as its sibling. 1 year of development maturation was a lot in NES time, and BIONIC Commando really shows it. It feels a lot more sophisticated than its brother in Bionic Arms. Its grappling is faster, more fluid, more dynamic, less haphazard. Still, there's a lot to like about Almana. It has an undeniably classic Konami feel, and if you can get past its clumsy grappling mechanics, it neatly walks the line between pure arcade experience and more adventuresome NES-era exploratory platformer. Certainly it has its fans. Developer Nigoro seems to have taken a fair amount of influence from the game for its LA-MULANA series. But since the Miracle of Almana has never been officially released in the US and has never been republished in Japan since its launch on Famicom Disk System 30 years ago, it's not really a game you can easily play without bending some copyright laws. But it's worth checking out even if by hook or by crook, especially for anyone with a certain fondness for that vintage 8-bit Konami house style.